Good morning. It's lovely to see all of you today. In 1989, there was an earthquake here in the Bay Area. Probably many of you were here. The Loma Prieta earthquake centered in Santa Cruz, and it snaked its way all the way up to San Francisco and caused a collapse of the piece of the Bay Bridge, which of course became the worldwide symbol of that earthquake. And that one image was flashed all around the world over and over and over again, so there was a great sense of imminent collapse created by that one image, imminent and actual collapse. In fact, although portions of the country, of the area were damaged, much of it was not. It wasn't as widespread as that made it seem. But anyone whose life was actually touched by that earthquake, which was most of our bodies, because we were somewhere and something began to shake, and I, to my everlasting embarrassment, instead of just centering myself and surrendering to the Guru, ran screaming from my apartment at the time, and to the amazingness of seeing the earth itself move. There's many things that we just accept as the given, and one of them is that the earth does not move, at least not in that particularly undulating manner. It just takes us apart. During that period of time, I was having what turned out to be an extremely brief career giving seminars in a corporate setting. It really ended up not being at all for me, but I was in the midst of my small rise and fall in that livelihood. And I had a very good relationship with a particular woman in one local corporation, and we were trying to decide what seminars I might do next. And she said that I think the husband of someone who worked in their company had been killed in the Bay Bridge collapse. And as a consequence, there was an all-pervasive anxiety in the company at that point because it was so close. She was walking around, she was now a widow, and that image had become very personal for them. So she said she wanted to do something that would help allay their enormous anxiety. Now, of course, the guidelines of working in corporate America, which is why I had to step away from it, is that you cannot say anything about religion or God. Absolutely forbidden, because they are secular, and if you give credit to one organization, one religion, you have to do it to all, and it's just an endless nightmare, so you can't do it zero. So it was always a great creative project to tell the truth without actually using any of the words that I would normally use. So she wanted me to allay their anxiety, but not do it in any kind of a religious way, spiritual way. So I'm a creative person. I said, okay. And then I thought about it for just a few minutes on the phone, and I finally said, it can't be done. There's just no way. I said, when you're talking about something like the earth moving, you have to be able to relate to a power higher even than the earth itself, what to speak of your own self. She said, well, can't you just give people faith in their own selves? I said, what, to keep the Bay Bridge from collapsing? It's like, it just can't be done. I'm sorry, it sounds good. It's convenient. It's nice to say, oh, God is old-fashioned, we're all self-reliant now. We have a new understanding. What I call it is just enough new understanding to be dangerous. There's an idea that, well, God is not some long-bearded figure up on a cloud directing, as Swami says, directing traffic on earth, and then you die and you get to wear white robes everlastingly and sing chants, hymns to this great figure. The scientific discoveries of what the world is like, our own expanding awareness on the planet of what truth is, it's very hard to accept those archaic, arcane images. They just don't work anymore. But what we've done instead, and I don't mean everyone, but what has been done instead is there's this increasing sense, right sense, that the power of truth lies within us. This is an age in which this mindless reliance on other people's dogmas is simply, it's hard to hold to that. Yes, there are people clinging ever more tightly, but the direction of our culture is away from all these rigidly imposed forms. The negative side of that is, well, the negative side of it is what you see. Exactly. Joseph Campbell, who was a great icon of the cultural myths of cultures and so on like that, he was talking in his wonderful interviews. Joseph Campbell, I might have said Joseph Smith, Joseph Campbell. He was talking about how those myths and stories, those symbolic stories, or what gives a culture its cohesion, its rich cohesion. And I think it was Bill Moyer said to him, well, what happens in a culture when you lose all those myths and unified stories? And Joseph Campbell sort of looked out the window of the American city where he was, and he said, this, where everybody's just grabbing at truth and hoping that they hit the right thing. I've shared with you before my young nephew, who's just in his late teens now, almost 20. He's a very fine person. I will modify any statement I say about him by saying that, but he's a product of his generation. And he was making some casual reference to something that he and his peers simply took for granted. And I said, you have actually no idea how morally reprehensible what you just said is, do you? And he really didn't, because there just are no standards, of family values or self-indulgence or sensuality or disrespect for authority. And of course, then I suddenly sounded like my parents. And the way they would talk to me in the 60s when, I was out doing all pretty much exactly the same things, and I didn't want to be there with him. So I tried to find the right perspective, and I finally said, well, look, here's the positive side of it. Whatever values your generation have will be entirely your own. They'll be self-generated. Nobody will have handed them to you. They will be what you yourself have discovered from your own experience is true. And to give him personal credit, his values are actually very, very strong because he has discovered them within. Now, the problem with this is the first stages of discovering things within, we just obviously cling to the obvious. And there is a progression in spiritual path. It isn't just that we go from absolute ignorance to self-realization, just sort of like first we're just a blob without knowing what we're doing, and bingo, we're Christ-like masters. Every step of the way is hard-earned by our own experience. And the first step of awakening is to recognize the capacity to generate from within ourselves magnetism, energy, willpower, success, creativity. And it's like, in order to come to the point where we can actually become devotees, we have to first have a very strong functioning ego. But we also have to realize that it can only take us so far. And so here I am with this woman. She wants me to make people unafraid of earthquakes by telling them they have the power within them to overcome those earthquakes. Well, this poor woman's husband didn't. He just happened to be on the bridge. Friends of ours, Gary McSweeney, I believe, had crossed that bridge just shortly before it collapsed. But it wasn't his karma to be on it at the moment of death. Who among us has the power over our own death? You have to start really with the biggest undermining factor to find out if a truth is true. If it's true, it has to be true all the way to the end. Now, it isn't, and this is where the spiritual path gets very subtle. It isn't that we therefore put our faith outside of ourselves. It all has to do with who we are and what we are really, and what does attunement really mean. Yesterday I taught a beginning meditation class, and there was a woman in the class who was born and raised in India, where she has had much more exposure to the principle of meditation. And so therefore, well, nobody these days is being introduced to it for the first time, whatever your culture, but she'd been really raised up in it. And I taught her what Paramhansa Yogananda teaches, scientific meditation. And afterwards, she said to me, she was so confused in how to put all this together, because the idea of going within, which is what she'd been heard since a child, she literally acted it out like this. She would go within, like this. So she was accustomed to sort of meditating like this, and just kind of drawing in more or less, somewhere between the lungs and the kidneys, just kind of in there with an almost physical concept that, if she could just get through the veins and the gore and the guts and all of that, that she would find some little core of wisdom. And I said, that's what Master calls unscientific attempts to realize the truth. Because it's simply not based on what we're really doing and what we teach and the way I was expressing it to her, even in talking about the spiritual eye, which is the image that's above the masters there. I always try to tell people to look out from where you are into this great expansiveness. Just liberate yourself from the captivity of the ego, which is here at the medulla, and look from the medulla out. And she said it was just so hard for her to understand how you could look out and still be thinking about yourself. But you see, that's all about that very, very tight concept of what is myself. Myself becomes what Swamiji calls this bundle of self-definitions, which is all based around the fact that we inhabit this single body. And we try to make this body and its ego stronger and stronger, but it's missing the concept. Where the real power comes is when we recognize I am the bubble. I am the little tiny bubble of laughter, as Master calls it in his poem. I, the little self, float in this cosmic sea. And the power that we have is not by becoming a super energized, magnificent bubble, but by just recognizing that, yes, there are these boundaries around our present state of awareness that define our present reach, but all of that exists as part of this much greater reality. And the real strength that we have is not by concentrating ever more deeply on the little me, but by learning to attune ourselves to a greater reality, by changing our self-definition from just what the ego already knows into this much greater awareness in which we see ourselves just moving on this great river of spirit. Swami Kriyananda, whom many of you had the opportunity to see a couple of weeks ago when he was here, we had this program at the San Jose Center for the Performing Arts, and because the theater is so large and because the technology was available, we had this huge video screen about 10 or 12 feet square that was set up right behind him and which was very close in on his face. So one was able to watch him speak to this very large crowd in this very large theater and still see the details of his face, which is not usually possible. Now, whenever one is speaking in intimate conversation, there's always this wonderful transference of consciousness through the face, through the eyes, through the expressions, and a great sense of intimacy. And people sitting in a living room together, there's no strain, there's just a feeling of being that way. Well, here was Swamiji speaking to this huge crowd, and you could look right at his eyes and his face, and as someone said, you could just tell that if it just at any moment he could say, oh, excuse me, he would just walk off. I mean, meaning that there was no, here I am talking to this big crowd of people. Here I am having to generate this energy to speak. I have shared with you sometimes, years ago, someone gave me a video of a celebrity recording session when they made a recording. This could have been, 20 or 30 years ago. The song was called We Are the World, and somebody's brainchild was that they would raise money for some cause. Might have been Africa, by having all these very well-known singers all come together, and each of them would sing the song, which I believe was composed of the words, we are the world. I think it also said, we are the children. We are the children, we are the world. The poetry left a little something to be desired, but the sentiment was very admirable. And they just took turns, and then somebody filmed the session where you saw all these well-known celebrities, each of them taking their turn at the microphone. This was their moment to really give it everything they had. And the song didn't have much scope, so they just had to do it. And what you watched, without exception, was each one of them just trying to make their physical body, and inside that their ego, stronger and stronger to give them energy. And you would see all this tension build, and there would be this sort of flipping around of the head, because the ego here, is when the ego gets tense, that's what happens. You watch a lot of people on television, they're just talking about the weather. And there's all this movement because this is where the ego is centered. This is the principle of proud people looking down their noses. And that's why the universal gesture of humility is to release that energy. Well, in contrast to that, we saw Swami Kriyananda sing. Swami sings pretty much like that. And then all that comes out is just because his sense of where his power comes from is in complete surrender of all this separateness, not winding that separateness up as tight as possible. You see? The ego gets its power from its unique position. The devotee gets its power from its unity with everything. And so watching Swami speak with this tremendous power, with this just sense of effortless ease, because where would effort come from if you're simply opening your window and allowing the sunlight to come through? We look at these windows with the sun shining through, and you don't sort of sense a great sense of strain in the window frame to be open to the window. In fact, it's just the opposite. All obstacles are being removed. Lately, I've been in a position where I've needed to define for someone who's completely unfamiliar with what we're doing, what makes Master's teachings unique. And I don't mean unique in the field of truth, but just what would define Ananda from many other offerings? The question was actually put to me, who are your competitors? I said, our competitors are anything or anyone that tells you that happiness lies outside yourself, that there's anything in this world that can give you the fulfillment that you're longing for. Anyone who increases awareness is our friend and our co-worker. Now, however, within that arena, there is this reality which distinguishes Sanatana Dharma, which distinguishes true self-realization from mere self-empowerment. And that is this single thought, what is the true source of our energy? Where does it really come from? Paramahansa Yogananda put it in this most beautiful manner when someone sort of asked him to define sort of what it meant to be a master. It was a beautiful explanation. He said, all of this world is manifested out of the consciousness of God. This is what the Bhagavad Gita phrases today. I am in everything, but everything is not me. I am everything, but it is not me. This is the Lord speaking, and this is how Master explains that. The great ocean of spirit lifts up in waves, lifts up in many different waves. And you look at the vast ocean, and there's areas of calm and areas of storm, and waves rising and waves falling. Well, the egoic self is those waves rising. And the more self-importance that little ego has, the more it tries to lift itself higher and higher above the ocean. Now, if you're watching it from the outside, you see how foolish that is. It whips itself up with storm energy and with wind, and when it finally can just stand up above all the other waves, it announces that it has arrived. But of course, we're all just watching, because inevitably, what will happen to that wave? No wave on the ocean can sustain itself separate from the ocean. It's the movement of the ocean that creates it in the first place. Well, you would think, just the natural egoic mind, you think, well, the Master is the biggest wave on the ocean. Wouldn't you think that? But he says it just the opposite. He said the Master remains right at the surface. The Master remains in total contact with the entire ocean and never bothers to separate itself out as a wave. The closer we live to the base, to the ocean itself, that's where real self-realization comes from. And also just think of it in terms of our power to move through this world, and our power to do good work, our power to be effective and aware of what we're doing. When the wave is separated out and so tense, trying to hold a position that can never be maintained. Our poor friends in that corporation who were in fact terrified by the presence of the earthquake and the sudden realization that no matter how effective they are in Silicon Valley, the whole earth can just shake. I mean, I stood there. I mean, I've been on these teachings for decades, and I stood there, and it was profoundly unnerving, is all I can say, in the midst of that earthquake, to watch our little swimming pool, to watch all the water in our swimming pool rise up higher than the fence, and a great deal of it just jump over the fence. You know, it's just like, no, these things don't happen. Trees are going like this, you know, you just feel, well, about as big as you are, which is just a smidgen. Many years ago, when I lived at Ananda Village, things were a little primitive then. We lived in a harmonious relationship with lots of cracks in the walls and things like that. And I had this typewriter, and I came to work one day, and there was this very small spider that had found its way to my desk and was having a tremendous adventure exploring my typewriter. And it was a very, to my interpretation, very cheeky little spider. And it would run across the space bar, and then it found itself on the W, and it surveyed its kingdom from the W, and then it would go across and went up to the platen up there, and he would survey its world, and I began to follow it with my thumb. With this awareness that even though it seemed so free that at any moment I could go, and that would just end of spider. And even as I was doing this, I felt this divine thumb right above my head that had followed me to work and was sitting there, and just here I am running around so self-importantly. But really, what is the source? Who am I? Swami Kriyananda years ago said, I never identify with Swami Kriyananda. I consider him an event for which I am responsible. And he's so fond of telling the story of once when he was introduced. He was speaking with this woman at a reception that was being held at an event, and they were chatting for a while, and he finally said, "What is your name?" She introduced herself, and she said, and who are you? He said, "I'm Swami Kriyananda." She went like this, "Oh, but you're important," like that. And he said, "Well, perhaps I'm well known, but you're famous." He said, "Well, perhaps I'm well known, but why do you say but?" "Well, every other famous person I've met seemed important." And so what he meant was self-important, of course. Well, here I am. My wave is so much bigger that all the other waves know my name and my face and all my accomplishments. But if you're just an event, where does that come from? And then you see how much freedom and power you have in that, because the anxiety that we all feel is our intuitive awareness that we're absolutely helpless in this world, aren't we? Oh yes, we can, be a success in our careers, and we can have an influence, we can do good work, we can be a very positive and a popular event. There's no reason not to be. If you're putting on an event, you should do it well. But deep within our hearts, we recognize that there's this cosmic thumb, if you want to call it that. There's always this power around us that we're just a little tiny, tiny, just grain of nothing in this infinity. We have two ways of relating to that. Either we live constantly with this subconscious anxiety over that. Swami described recently that there's certain something that always makes us tense. And it's that identification with the ego, the profound understanding of our absolute vulnerability. I mean, you can blot that out. You can distract yourself with drugs, drinking, television, activity, money, all sorts of things. But deep within us, it's always there. Unless and until we simply say, "But of course, I am nothing." That's why so many saints that look so magnificent to us, they write this beautiful poetry, they sing those songs. Swami has a beautiful song. "I am nothing, I am free. I own nothing, I am free. I am no one, I am free." It's just so joyful. "I own nothing, I am free. And myself, I am free. I am no one, I am free. In myself, I am free." You see how wonderful that is? And because also, you see, there's real power in that. Because now, instead of desperately trying to hold our wave up, we have just decided to cooperate with the sea. This is, I'm an event. We are responsible. We must be conscientious. That's how we grow. But deep within our hearts, Swamiji always says, the only way to judge spiritual freedom is not what happens outside of us. We have all this karma to work out. You never know. The only measure of spirituality is how free we are in our hearts. How deeply we understand, I am nothing. I am free. Isn't that beautiful? Because in all things, God dwells. All of us. Like the wind blowing on the spirit, that is who we are. Bless you.